Hello everyone, welcome to today's seminar for the CliniKids Autism Seminar Series. We're so delighted that you've been able to join us to be able to talk about all things mental health. My name is Gail Alvarez. I'm a researcher here at CliniKids. For those of you who are not familiar with CliniKids, we're the Telephone Kids Institute's clinical service for children diagnosed with autism and developmental delays and their families, providing research evidence into clinical practice. And we're absolutely delighted to share with you some of the work that we're doing, but also to talk about a really important topic for children diagnosed with autism and their families. And we hope you learn a little bit more. And also, please bring along your questions. We'd love to be able to help answer them and discuss your concerns. And I'll throw over to Dr Mei'en Lim to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Mei'en. I'm the clinic lead at CliniKids. Lots of clinically going around. I'm also a clinical psychologist. I also wanted to clarify a little bit that the doctor is not a medical term. I do not have any medical training. In case of a medical emergency, do not ask me for help. I do have a PhD, which simply means I can read very fast. I work alongside speeches and OTs at the clinic, and it is one of our greatest privileges to be able to help autistic children with developmental delays. One of the beautiful things I love about working alongside these colleagues is that we're all very people-centered, so we keep the child and the family in the center of everything that we do. What we do is also evidence-based, which is absolutely amazing, and everyone has a real thirst for getting better at what we do. Upskilling is really important to us. So yeah, back to you, Gil.
Alrighty, so let's get started on today's seminar. Before we kick off, we'd like to acknowledge the beautiful lands on which May and myself and our local team have the privilege to work and meet on, which is the lands of Numa Wujak Buja, from where this photo was taken of. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and the lands on which many of you will meet on, which is probably all around Australia and from other parts of the world. And we'd like to pay our deepest respects to elders past and present for their ongoing generosity and commitment to particularly to the work that we do at Telephone Kids Institute. And before we get started, let's just talk about that everyone is welcome here. This is a space for you to learn a little bit more, but and you can find and use your own strategies to help you feel relaxed, to stay engaged. Some of the content we talk about today might be difficult or it might not be right for you. Please feel free to leave if it's not right for you. The seminar is also recorded. If you'd like to come back, please, you can always come back. Submit any questions you have as well. Submit them throughout the seminar or at the end. If you are watching a recording, please feel free to send us an email. I've got some acknowledgement of the types of funding that I've gotten research funding for, and really a deep acknowledgement and gratitude for all the families, communities, advisors, stakeholders who contribute to our everyday work, and especially for the research participation that many of our families generously contribute to. So what are we going to cover in today's seminar? So we're going to go through a couple of things, and we're going to give you kind of a whistle-stop tour of a range of topics related to mental health. Maybe just start off with a little bit more of some definitions and concepts, talk about some really hard stats and the reasons why mental health is a challenge for many autistic children and young people. We'll go through the evidence for different kinds of supports, some of which will be things that are in the research space, some are in the clinical space, but really around some of the things that we have got some evidence for as well that we're doing research or our colleagues are doing some great research in. And then we'll end with some more practical tips and supports that Mei'en will reflect on. And throughout the seminar, Mei'en will chime in with some important insights as we go through a lot of this kind of quite deep research. We'll end with some question time, so please do chime in with some questions as you've got them. So let's discuss what we even mean when we're talking about the concept of mental health and well-being, because we talk about mental health a lot, you hear about it a lot, but what do we actually mean? And I think this framework is actually a really nice way of thinking about mental health and wellbeing, particularly when it comes to children. So this figure is from the National Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy Report, which was released by the Mental Health Commission here in Australia a couple of years ago now. And this was a figure that came out to really conceptualize what we mean of when we think about mental health and wellbeing. We think about children's mental health and wellbeing as on a continuum or on a spectrum. So this is probably the one context when a linear spectrum actually makes sense. So we think about being well or being mentally well as being from a state of well to unwell, but not in a binary sense. We think of also being able to cope, where you might have challenges, but you have some mental resources or strategies or supports to be able to help cope with those challenges. You might also be struggling or really needing some support and maybe not managing some of those challenges as effectively as you could. And then you might be more unwell and needing some more significant supports, maybe seeking support from a professional. And so in this strategy, we actually have this really nice framework. And in this strategy, it really articulates how every child, indeed all children, have the human right to experience good mental health and well-being. And we need to do everything we possibly can to enable children to reach their full potential, to lead lives to their fullest, and to be able to adapt and cope with challenges as they emerge. And this is absolutely still true for autistic children. And in this model, we also see that potentially if we provide supports earlier, when children are maybe at the earlier stages of struggling before they reach the stage in which they might be seeking support, this might be opportunities for us to provide some really interesting and evidence-based supports. So the goal then really is, how do we help support children to develop strategies or to be equipped with strategies and resources to keep them in this between well to coping stage, to either be experiencing positive mental health and wellbeing, or to experience challenges as children and anyone does, but have resources that are equipped to help them deal with those challenges, to keep them kind of on that left-hand side of that framework. Again, this is something that comes from this mental health and wellbeing strategy report that really identified a range of focus areas for supporting Australian children's mental health and wellbeing. And there are 4 key areas, but some of the things that we'll talk about in this seminar really focus, I guess, around the individual child and to a certain extent their family and the support networks. But it's really important to think about that children, families and communities sit within a broader system and context, and that there are things that we can do at lots of different levels, at an education level, at the service level, do research, but all of these things are interconnected. So even if there are things that you hear about in this presentation where you might think, well, what about this and that? That's absolutely true. We also, while we're focusing on some things around the individual and at the more clinical end, absolutely children sit within a context, a broader environmental and family context as well. So let's talk about why we would focus on mental health for autistic children and young people. Overwhelmingly, there's very significant evidence that mental health conditions frequently co-occur for autistic individuals across the lifespan, and that this is actually the norm rather than the exception. So this was a figure that I encountered probably a little bit earlier on into our research program that really changed the way I thought about how frequent mental health conditions occur for autistic children and young people. So this is a graph that illustrates that if you think about the lines as the size or the frequency in which these conditions occur, things that we think about as commonly co-occurring with autism, language delays, global developmental delays, are definitely more frequent for children diagnosed with autism, but mental health conditions as a whole are by and far the most significant co-occurring conditions for autistic individuals. And of these, particular anxiety concerns are very big and very highly prevalent within individuals on the spectrum across the lifespan. Again, because we're scientists, we love data, and so there are only a few graphs in this presentation, but this one is a really confronting one. And I think around the mental health conditions that are experienced by autistic people, we see that things like anxiety, depression, self-harm, and also to a certain extent sleep disorders as well, if we group these together, are very highly prevalent. This data, or this graph, comes from a very large epidemiological survey, or study, of more than 1 million people in Sweden, of which over 20,000 were identified as autistic. And of those, more than 7,000 were female assigned at birth. So this was a really interesting study because they wanted to understand not just how frequent mental health conditions occur, but also what was the intersection with sex differences. Now, really soberingly, by the age of 25, over 77% of autistic women and 62% of autistic men had been diagnosed with at least one mental health condition. And this is compared to non-autistic men and women of about 14% and 9%. So really large differences in rates of getting a diagnosed mental health condition. And in more challenging data as well, we see that, for autistic women, by the age of 25, 1 in 3 in this sample had been hospitalised with a psychiatric disorder or mental health condition. And this was 6 times the rate than for women without an autism diagnosis, and nearly twice that than for autistic men. So we see not just frequently co-occurring mental health conditions for autistic individuals, but also some differences in sex as well. And then lastly, we also see differences by age. So this is a bit of a busy graph, but effectively the takeaway is we see not just high frequency of mental health conditions for autistic individuals, and we don't just see differences by sex, but we also see differences by age, and that many of these conditions can be diagnosed and identified very early on for children. Lastly, I guess what we can take away from a lot of these big data sets that we have been learning from in the last sort of 10 to 20 years or so is the longitudinal effects, or the time course, the trajectory of some of these symptoms. So longitudinal research, or studying people repeatedly over time, really has only been emerging in the last little while, because it takes time to assess people over multiple time points in their life. This was a study of about 250 autistic young people, followed from childhood all the way to young adulthood to 25. And really, the majority of autistic young people reported symptoms at a very high clinical level that persisted over time. Anxiety symptoms were really stable across their childhood for those where it was a concern. And for children who didn't have an intellectual disability or didn't have a cognitive difficulty, anxiety symptoms were really the most prevalent and persistent. So the takeaway from all of this big data that I've just thrown at you is really that mental health disorders are very frequent for autistic children, young people, and individuals more broadly, and clinical symptoms as well emerge early and are persistent over time. And so, Mei'en, I'm really curious to hear what your clinical perspective is when you hear all of these numbers and you see these figures.
Yeah, I think it's quite telling, isn't it? That they are an across the lifespan concern. And one thing that I'd love for parents or educators or even clinicians to take home today is to hold in mind that the way they present themselves is probably going to be quite different. A 5-year-old who experiences some anxiety might look like hiding behind their parent, not wanting to talk in certain unfamiliar situations. That would look quite different from a 12-year-old who maybe starts to say, I don't really want to go to school, or I'm not sure if I have any friends, even though you know they do. And that again is going to look quite different from an 18-year-old who maybe now has good friends, but starts to seem a bit flat, or starts to question their sexuality, their gender, and suddenly not able to do things that they previously could. You could catch a bus to school. Why has that stopped now? And so even in the rooms, I often see parents going, well, they used to do that and then they got over it. This is fantastic. And I thought we were done with that, but now we're not. Like, what's happened? Have we regressed? And I think just holding in mind that the way things show up, the way anxiety shows up, the way depression shows up, can look really different across the lifespan. And I'll touch on that a little bit more, but I'm not going to hijack the rest of your session, Gil. Thanks.
Thanks, Mei'en. So then let's talk about the impact of mental health conditions for autistic children and young people then. So it's unsurprising then, if we think about all of those really significant stats, that individuals diagnosed with autism will experience a wide range of functional impacts from experiencing mental health concerns, particularly when they're experienced early. So we know a lot of this research comes from understanding the experiences of autistic adults. Autistic adults will often report or at higher likelihood of reporting increased loneliness, experience difficulties with their sleep, will report increased suicidal ideation, and report reduced quality of life, and really a wide range of effects on school, participation in everyday activities, the things that they enjoy, and actually on their wider families and support networks as well. And we know that there's a really complex bidirectional relationship between parent and family mental health with their child's mental health as well. So I guess this maybe raises the question, why? Why do we actually see that mental health conditions are so prevalent for autistic children and young people? And I guess it's not going to be helpful, but it's complicated. It's very complicated. And it's also true in the non-autistic population that it is complicated. But I brought this figure up to illustrate, I guess, a little bit of the complexity, and to also illustrate, this was a paper that got published within the last few months, but really bringing together the range of different risk factors that contribute, or are plausible contributing mechanisms, to why some mental health conditions co-occur with autism. And so this review really highlights both the complexity, but also to recognise the overlap between a lot of these things. So the shared genetic, biological type risk factors that we think about in more the research context, but then all the individual things that might predispose individuals to experience mental health concerns at higher likelihood, but also the environmental factors. And that's what I really want to focus on in this. So really, while some of the things we talk about, particularly when we're at the therapy or the supports end, is that we think about the individual factors, the things that we're presented with. But of course, it's really important that we really recognise that there are a range of environmental and socio-contextual cultural factors that really contribute to the experience of various mental health conditions and symptoms. And many of these things have very significant effects on autistic people's mental health that are absolutely within our control as a society that we can help change. So while we're talking about some of the individual factors here in this presentation, we have to recognise that many of the environments that autistic people are in are simply not going to set them up for success, that many of our environments are not inclusive or supportive of neurodivergent experiences. We also have more and more research being done into understanding what's known as the double empathy problem, so the mutual misunderstanding between autistic and non-autistic individuals and the challenges that can occur in interpersonal communication. We also know that there's really hard research being done in the last few years about the increased rates of bullying, victimization, adverse childhood adverse experiences, and even adverse experiences that are experienced at the healthcare setting. And all of these things will have very significant and negative impacts on individuals' mental health and their experiences of trauma as well. So in the background of this complexity, we just have to acknowledge that our solutions here are going to have to be multifaceted. They're going to be things that we do at the individual level, but as well as things that we have to target at a societal and system level as well. And it's really important that we hold those two things in mind when we're talking about some of the more specific research we're going to talk about. Now, what happens then when individuals actually know that they need help, or a family knows that they want to get help? We know that many autistic people report that they have unmet mental health needs, but actually can't get the help that they need. That even when they ask for support services, so in a particular survey of wanting psychological services, only a small proportion of individuals are actually even offered it. And we know that there are a range of barriers to actually even accessing and supporting help. Things like even understanding what are the experiences you're having and knowing to actually go to seek help. Limited information for across the board about where you actually go, who are the right people to ask help from. And then, are there actually specialist providers, people who actually understand your experiences as an autistic person, that actually can meet those needs? And that many of our systems and services are not really well designed, especially across the healthcare setting. This is not specific to mental health, that will meet the needs of what autistic people want and need to access appropriate healthcare. And then, of course, we're in a context of the pandemic has really challenged healthcare providers, but particularly mental health care providers, and there is a real lack of availability across the widespread sector, and the ongoing costs of care can be really prohibitive for some individuals, and sometimes it is a balance between meeting your basic needs or meeting your mental health care needs. So this very challenging state of affairs has really been termed the autism mental health crisis, and it is absolutely a crisis. And in this paper that was published a couple of years ago, the author really termed this as a crisis that can be really epitomized by the following paradox: that we absolutely know that autistic people have a very high chance of developing mental health problems, but a very low chance of receiving effective help. And this is an absolutely dire state of affairs that we need to do better about. So what can we do, at least at the clinical end? So when we are talking about families presenting for services, what do we have evidence for? So some examples of some evidence-based supports, which is an absolutely non-exhaustive list, but it's just a list of some things that you might have heard of, things that you might actually reach out to a psychologist to get supports with. So cognitive behavioural therapies, for example, are evidence-based supports, so are mindfulness and acceptance commitment therapies. And as a group, these kinds of approaches are really around how we understand emotions, thoughts, physical feelings, where we are in a present moment, behaviours, to really address some of the challenges that you're wanting or have goals around seeking support in. And really with each of these therapies, they have different modalities, different targets. Many of them have solid evidence base in the non-autistic population. Some of them have variable efficacy in the autistic population. This evidence is really accumulating over the last decade or so. And it's really important to know that it's, the evidence for this is somewhat emerging in some areas and is really strong in some other areas. But what we're starting to learn now is that by understanding the perspectives of autistic people in receiving some of these approaches and how we may be able to co-design new and effective therapies, we may be able to understand how best to tailor and support these programs. But this is such an early stage that many of the evidence is really at these things may or may not be acceptable, but we are working on those clinical trials to find out whether they're effective. So it's a really emerging, very exciting space to be in as a clinical research scientist. So Mei'en, can I get your thoughts really? You're really at this end of the spectrum in terms of how you provide supports. What are your thoughts around evidence-based supports for autistic children and young people?
Yeah, my initial thought is I love them all. And I think, in the same way that autism lies on the spectrum, there's no two autistic people with exactly the same presentations. Maybe if we pull it back a little bit, there's really no two humans that present in the same way. And so I think as a clinician, I need to be flexible with my choice of therapy. So I might attempt a cognitive behavioral one and realize, oh, that actually doesn't fit very well. I might move to mindfulness, and maybe with mindfulness of the breath for some of my clients who are really anxious actually makes them more anxious. And if I'm sticking to it and just going, no, I know this works, you're just not following it, we're not doing it right, try harder. Then I think I've got the wrong approach. So I think for a clinician's perspective, it really is about us being able to flex to the individual that's in front of us. And what came to mind as I was mulling over this today was it's a bit like ink blots on a piece of paper, isn't it? When you've got a splash of ink, no two ink blots are exactly the same. And then we throw color in, and then we throw different materials of paper in. And all of a sudden, there's this beautiful, unique space where I might draw a little bit from a CBT approach. I might draw a bit from mindfulness, but I also would draw from acceptance and commitment because that's values-based and it's a bit more existential, philosophical. Why are you here? What holds you together? But that's actually a really important question that an 18, 20, 35-year-old might be asking. Maybe not so much an 8-year-old, but yeah. It's really important also to be able to access mental health care. And I think that's the thing that you'll be touching on next, Gil.
Yes. So really, when we're thinking about our existing mental health care systems, support services, we actually really focus, I guess, on this tertiary end, or at least when people are really unwell and they're seeking support and need support. But I think it's not a very good analogy, but an imperfect analogy is really around the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And so this is a poem that we gets used a lot in the area of early healthcare. And this is around, if we already know that there's a reason why people are falling off a cliff, why would we park an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff rather than understand what is it that we could do upstream, or maybe put a fence there? So my question is, why do we wait? Why can't we do things to really, while we have really good evidence base around certain approaches at the unwell stage where we can provide supports, why can't we do things earlier, or even to help reduce or prevent some of those later downstream effects? And that's what a lot of some of the work we'll talk about next. So this is kind of the current state of our affairs, and it has been this current state for some time, that we already know that mental health concerns are highly prevalent for autistic people, and particularly for children and young people. We have a significant gap between the needs that people ask for and need and the services that we currently have that are not fit for purpose. We have evidence-based programs that seem to work well in some non-autistic populations, but are variable in efficacy and may or may not be suitable depending on age or context. And our systems are just not well equipped at the point that they are now. So really our research program is around how do we work with our colleagues, our partners, our stakeholders, and importantly, children and families to identify what are the supports that families want and what are the areas in which they need help with. Can we do things earlier in childhood when we already know some of these concerns are emerging? And are there ways that we can help reduce or even prevent longer-term mental health related disability? And it might sound like a pipe dream, but I really feel like we have really significant inroads with some of the programs that we're working on. So the goal for really us here is really around how can we have research that meaningfully translates into clinical practice. I'm going to give you 4 different examples of how this is working or could be working. So from some recently completed clinical trials, some ones that are currently underway, and then some new ones that are currently. And these are just some tailored kind of tasters, I guess, a little, degustation of things that we're kind of working on. So sleep. Sleep is a very big challenge. Many people will commonly report that their child has significant sleep challenges. It's experienced by up to 80% of autistic children. Well, parents will report very significant sleep challenges, things like difficulties falling asleep or maintaining sleep, the length of sleep duration or the amount of quality of sleep. And we know that this is very significantly related to anxiety, but has a really significant functional impact for quality of life for children and for families. And for those of you who have children who have difficulties with sleep, you'll know what I mean. But we also know that the importance of sleep. Sleep is important for lots of different reasons, but we also know that it has a very strong relationship to later mental health outcomes as well. So we absolutely have an opportunity here to do something. Mei'en, I think from your perspective, what are the kinds of things that you notice families report about sleep difficulties for particularly for younger children on the spectrum?
Yeah, I think this is potentially where anxiety might rear its ugly head. We start to see kids suddenly really wanting to talk about their day or ruminating about something that happened at school or something that even happened way back when. You're like, how come you still remember that? And they seem to almost go over and over again and again about the difficult interactions, no matter how you try and problem solve it for them. That sort of just keeps repeating itself. And I think that's a really nice tell that maybe something else is going on in their little brains. And it's not just that they don't want to go to bed or just a smart way of procrastinating sleep time. That something potentially might actually be weighing on their minds.
Yeah, and have a very then consequential effect on their ability to settle and get into that kind of more restful state. So we actually know that there's a range of different things that can be done that have good solid evidence base, but it's complicated for children diagnosed with autism because some of these might not have necessarily the same effectiveness. But if we think about a non-pharmacological approach for supporting sleep difficulties, there actually has been a program called Sleeping Sound, which was actually originally developed by colleagues over in Victoria that really targets behavioural sleep challenges in a kind of a very brief model. And it was designed specifically for children diagnosed with ADHD. And our colleagues in Melbourne did a very, very large clinical trial that trialled out this program for children diagnosed with autism with their families, and actually found not only were there very significant improvements in sleep problems from this very brief behavioural approach, it was 2 sessions, so a very brief program, that this actually had a consequential effect in improving aspects of children's and parents' mental health and quality of life. So there's some really interesting hints here that this might be effective. But of course, this requires access to a highly trained specialist with who understands sleep difficulties. So a PhD student has just finished, and I wish I could share the data with you, but has just finished a clinical trial evaluating this program as a telehealth model, so rolling this out to families across Australia, and found really significant kind of effects, really in line with the original trial, but really importantly found that it was really feasible and acceptable to deliver. And for me, this immediately raises the question, how would could this actually have a knock-on effect for improving mental health outcomes in the future? And I think there will be some future research in this area, but I'll put a link to the Sleeping Sound at the end of this seminar, because I think it's a really interesting approach to really tackling anxiety concerns from a different perspective. But on, I guess, the anxiety concerns, so this is something that Mei'en and I spend a lot of time working in, and particularly an area called uncertainty-related anxiety. So this is anxiety concerns that really are around not knowing what's going to happen next and having significant distress or anxiety or uncertainty or worry about not knowing what will happen, or not having enough information, or not getting enough information that you might feel like you need. And this is actually not something unique to autism. It's something that we think about more from a generalized anxiety approach. But we know from really decades of research that this specific anxiety related to uncertainty seems to be highly prevalent for many autistic people. But we didn't know when we started this work whether or not it was relevant for young children. We sort of knew clinically that this was something we would observe in the clinic, but didn't actually know. So a PhD student in our team, Claudia Ong, has led a program of work really around understanding the nature of these concerns, and then of doing a clinical trial of trying to understand if we could support these concerns. So this might look like, for example, having a lot of distress if the teacher changes the next day, if a teacher's sick and not knowing who the new teacher will be, or if your aides change unexpectedly. Some children had really specific sensory related uncertainty, so not just being having difficulty about public toilets because of the sensory component, but the uncertainty component of when will the hand dryer go on? When will the flush go off? Who will be there? What will it smell like? So really an overlap between sensory differences as well as uncertainty anxiety. Or even a really common one was being really afraid of going to a birthday party because of the concern of not really knowing what would happen, what kinds of activities would be there, who would be there, how many people would be there, and needing to ask lots of questions and then not being able to go because of that anxiety. So this research really found that for the first time that this was actually a really relevant thing for really young children, and made us ask, do we think that this could actually be something we could support in our therapies? So actually, our colleague in the UK, Professor Jackie Rogers, has developed a whole program of work around developing a parent group program to support children diagnosed with autism who experience this kind of uncertainty-related anxiety. So the program is called Coping with Uncertainty in Everyday Situations, or CUES, and it was originally designed for school age to sort of early teenage years type age range. Children diagnosed with autism who are experiencing these sorts of anxiety, but uniquely works with parents. And that's because we know that working with parents to really be agents of change for their child is a really powerful model of care. And so there's really some good evidence for this program in terms of it being acceptable to families, feasible to administer, some good preliminary efficacy. But we wanted to know, this seems like a really good approach. And we already know while really young children are showing this anxiety, why couldn't we do this in the early years? So we got some funding to be able to work with families to understand whether this would be an appropriate program and also whether we should adapt anything. And of course, we needed to do some adaptations to make sure, just flick through this, to make sure it was, I guess, appropriate developmentally for very young children. There are things that we do in some of our psychological therapies that need developmental adaptations, making things a bit simpler, using more concrete representations, making sure that the types of strategies we're using are really appropriate for young children. And then what we wanted to do is then trial this in a very large clinical trial. So we evaluated this program with children diagnosed with autism at age 4 to 7 who are presenting here in Perth. And we included some other things like making sure that we were focusing on promoting positive parent-child interactions, co-regulation, attachment principles, that kind of thing. And we had two main questions for this study. Is the program effective at the end of this, at the end of 8 weeks? Now, with the 8 weeks is actually a very short amount of time. It's a very, in other types of programs, this is quite a short amount of time to actually exhibit any kind of change. And two months later, once we've stopped the program and parents are out being able to implement the strategy in their everyday life, do we see that those effects are maintained if we see any significant effects? So we got this funding in 2020, so a very different period of time. And we very fortunately, despite all of the challenges that occurred across the period we did this program, we were actually still able to do these entirely in person, albeit with some social distancing and some mask wearing in the middle there. And we were able to run it as small groups with parents. We were able to deliver it with our wonderful psychology team here, and really found that at the end of the study that we found that we had families who were very able to complete the program. We had about 64 families randomized into this study and complete the program. We also had very good satisfaction across the sessions. And even though we ran the program entirely independently of the original program developer, we're able to deliver this program almost entirely to protocol. So very, very high, what we call therapist fidelity, which is a very good thing from a research perspective. Mei'en was actually the lead, is our lead clinical psychologist, supervised all of our psychologists who delivered the program and has delivered the program herself. What's your clinical perspective of how you found running the Q's Junior program?
Yeah, I think the feedback from the psychs as well as the prof psychs and the trainee psychologists who did it was very well received. The parents certainly felt a real sense of camaraderie next to, other parents who were experiencing the same or very similar issues. And so they just felt really held. So I think the paradigm shift, the strategies, the being able to come alongside people who are kind of on the same boat, and if not at least on the same river, that really was a source of comfort to parents.
Yeah, and I think a group therapy model as well is also incredibly powerful for not just learning content, but also for feeling like you're heard and you're not alone, that there are similarities in your experiences that are shared by other people. So we think that this program is a really effective model of change for our families. But the important thing is, do we think it's effective? And so at the end of the program, we found some very encouraging findings. We found that 1/3 of children were rated as clinically improved by independent raters. And we found the parent questionnaires when we were looking at parent questionnaires, we found reductions in child uncertainty, anxiety, and really interestingly on parent outcomes. So parent satisfaction really increased. This is again, only 2 months after the program. So at the end of the program, so in 2 months' time. 2 months later, we actually saw even further improvement. So 59% of children were rated as clinically improved 2 months afterwards without any further input from our therapists, and knock-on effects for broader anxiety as well as broader parental stress as well. So we think that this program seems to have some good preliminary evidence that it could be supportive. So while we think that this program holds a promise in providing early supports for the sort of early anxiety concerns that we were already observing appear for younger autistic children, we do know that there are going to be still some barriers to engaging in a program like this. We know that parent-mediated approaches are really an effective model of care, but it does place a lot of demand on caregivers. And we also know that not everyone can participate. We had families who really wanted to trial out this program, but absolutely couldn't attend an in-person session during business hours because people work and have very busy lives or have other caregiving responsibilities, or really attending a session in our particular geographic location wasn't going to be suitable. We live in a very, very large country with very large distances between not even just our suburbs, but our regional centres as well. So we need to find different ways of providing effective supports for families. So what are we going to do? Well, we already have gotten funding to be able to adapt and co-design this program for an online solution. So we've gotten funding from the Western Australian Future Health Research and Innovation Fund, and we're currently we're at the end of a process. I'll flick through this quickly. We've currently completed an 18-month process of working with families, stakeholders, clinicians, all together to compile a range of feedback and processes around adapting this program, making it not just a telehealth version, but an actual online solution that might meet the needs of what families told us they wanted from this program. And we currently have started a feasibility trial evaluating the program, and it's open to anyone in Australia. So if you're interested in being able to trial this out, please click to the little QR code thing up there. Two last things that we'll talk about. The sibling relationship. This is something that emerged, it emerged from what families were telling us of needing supports for their non-autistic child, the sibling of an autistic child. And that is because, we understand very much so that siblings are a really important and essential relationship for those who have siblings. Often they'll be the longest relationship that you might have if you have a sibling. But we also know that it's very complex for children who have a sibling who has a disability or an additional learning challenge, or indeed is autistic. Because there are both rich opportunities and amazing things that happen when you have an autistic sibling, but there are also ongoing challenges that may not be met by current services or support needs, or may not be recognised. And we know that siblings of neurodivergent young people often have unreported or unmet mental health needs or emotional difficulties that they might want support with, but maybe can't get access to. So the program that we've developed, which we've called CliniKids, is actually born out of what families were telling us. They were worried about their other children who maybe weren't diagnosed, that there might be perceptions of differential parenting, but they really wanted a way in which they could foster positive relationships between their children. So the targets of the program are really around how do we balance some of the known recognized challenges for siblings, but also fostering positive relationships and building emotional intelligence or literacy or understanding about your emotions and your feelings, but also building awareness and understanding about autism as well, to be able to foster those positive relationships and build strong relationships going forward. So the program actually developed over a period of 12 months, and we were very fortunate last year to also then get some funding to actually be able to evaluate this and to see what parents and children's perspectives were. So it's designed originally for school-age children with small groups of similar age children, so that siblings can learn from each other, hear from each other, as well as get to engage with other children who have very similar shared experiences, covering topics like understanding autism, sharing experiences, developing some adaptive coping strategies when things might be maybe not going so well, and how to learn and recognize when to seek support. We think this is a really good program, but of course we are all about evidence. So the funding that we've got has definitely enabled us to be able to evaluate this. We're still in the process of doing this study, so we're compiling all of our information from children and parents, but overwhelmingly we have already found that it seems to be not just valuable, but really an important thing for children to understand more about their autistic sibling. Mei'en, as someone who's been involved in this program, tell me a little bit about your perspective of this sibling program.
Absolutely. So what we realized, which was probably very similar to Q's, was that families were finding it difficult at times to attend in person. And so we've stepped it up and have decided to do an adaptation called support. So CliniSib still remains as a group approach, and SIP support will be a one-to-one sort of approach. And we're hoping that in doing so, we continue to support families. Families come across as a real sense of guilt, right? There's a sibling that gets dragged along to every therapy, and exactly like those things that were said, some favoritism, not really understanding autism, really having a dislike of autism, all that sort of stuff. And that's why we created this program, is to help siblings understand and still feel valued and still feel like an important part of the family, and for parents to really feel like they're also doing something actively to support their child.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections, Mei'en. One last thing, and then I'm going to throw to Mei'en to bring us back to the practical. This is a program that has just started, and it's really around the notion of self-compassion. We haven't talked about self-compassion as a modality for supporting mental health, but it's really a sort of a newer area of clinical practice around the understanding a healthier way of relating to oneself and treating yourself with kindness during moments of challenge or suffering. And it comprises things like being kind to yourself, appreciating and recognizing our common humanity, that other people experience challenges as well, and incorporating practices of mindfulness. And there's a lot of evidence that self-compassion programs or training can be an effective model of supporting mental health outcomes. But our colleagues at Aspect have really been leading the way in doing this program of work for autistic people. So they've developed a self-paced free online self-compassion course for autistic adults and found some incredible findings. They found not just increases in things like positive emotions and self-compassion, but decreases in anxiety, depression, and emotion regulation challenges. So really an important program. It's something that can be done at your own pace, that whatever feels right for you, and has really been informed and led by autistic people. But for us, when we were talking about this as colleagues, I was like, this could be something that could absolutely be cultivated for parents of autistic children who are often faced with lots of challenges and often could could very much engage with practices that aren't really about being kind to oneself and recognizing and appreciating how well they're doing. So we wanted to know, is cultivating a practice of self-compassion beneficial for parents? So we have just launched this study with our colleagues Chris Edwards and Marie Kai at Aspect that will actually be trialling a very brief workshop for parents of autistic children that cultivates self-compassion. And we want to know from a research perspective, does this improve parental self-compassion? But importantly, does it improve well-being, mental health outcomes, as well as for children's mental health and well-being? And this will be a really interesting study, and you can absolutely find more about this using the QR code on this screen as well. So before I hand over to Mei'en, I think I've given you kind of like quite a lot of information, but I think hopefully you come away with a sense of understanding a little bit more about some of the individual supports, programs that could work to support individuals, children, families, siblings, but that this also sits within a context of a broader, wider context in which we need to provide mental supports and change mental health trajectories for autistic children and young people. So multi-tiered approaches are really absolutely needed in this context, and we need to provide more supports, but also more funding in many different areas, but supporting families, communities, education, improving access and reducing barriers, and absolutely about empowering the workforce to be able to provide those sort of specialist supports for children and young people. And that's where I'm going to hand over to Mei'en to talk a little bit more about the role of clinical psychology in this space.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Gil. So I had a little Google because I remember when I was back in uni, people often said, "What is psychology? Can you read my mind?" I'm like, "No, that's a psychic." So specifically, a role of clinical psychology in the space of supporting autistic children and young people is we start thinking about, okay, the child in a system, the parents kick in, right? Parental family of origin, how does that happen? Sometimes it's a pull, sometimes it's a push. I was parented this way, don't ever want that. I was parented this way, I love it, I'm going to do that again. And sometimes we don't necessarily work through those things until we're actually a parent. And when you're a parent, you're in the throes of it, you don't actually have time to pull back and reflect. And that's what a ClinPsych is going to do in that space. Let's have a think about your parenting. Where did that come from? How did that come to be? Second bit would be understanding function of behavior. It sounds very blah. Essentially, it's the idea of we're co-developing strategies together with the family to better identify what are the challenging behaviors, when does it happen, who's around, what happens after that, and just really putting on that sort of hat of how is this recurring, what can we do about it. Understanding the development in the lifespan, that's incredibly important because there's certain things we know happen at certain stages and ages. If you have a child, you would know fear of the dark is a common one. I'm stuck there. They might have questions about death. What happens after we die? And there are certain ages we can kind of expect that to happen. And when it does, I love being able to unpathologize it. This is actually a really, I guess, expected part of growing up. Asking these questions is part of life. And so let's embrace it. Let's lean into it. The next bit we think about also is kind of how we started. How is the family system working? And I love that picture that you showed earlier on about all these different aspects that come into play when we think about the child. It's the same thing with the family system. Who's in the family? Who are the external caregivers? Where does a sibling come in? How does that interaction, dyadic work? Where does it all fit in? We ask those questions. And then the last bit is obviously understanding what's effective, what's evidence-based. It's really important to be able to know, I suppose, what works, what doesn't, being able to, like I said earlier on, pivot, being able to know this is the right approach for something like that, and when do we step in. So that's all the stuff that a clinical psychologist does. We're going to now move on to the common challenges in science. So what sort of challenges are commonly experienced by the families that we see? And I suppose really, again, going back to, let's think through the developmental context of this. What does that mean? Actually means at these particular ages, you'd probably be a bit scared of the dark. You'll be scared. I was scared of the toilet too, by the way. I was convinced a shark would come out. And so I had no concept of a shark can't fit inside there. So again, I'm not old enough to understand that. So that fear to me is really real. And how do we as parents come alongside them to support them, to encourage them, and to help them understand that that's actually really okay? We talked also earlier on about uncertainty-related anxiety. What does that look like? Interestingly, that obviously also intersects with the feature of rigidity. So part of a ClinPsych's job is to be able to think through that a little bit, understand the family a little bit more, understand the child a little bit more, and start to see what areas can we flex those things in. When you think about emotional regulation, that's like all the rage, right? Dysregulation, like what does that actually mean? I like to think about it in terms of external. So it might be kicking or screaming or biting or really quite upset. And then there's an inward sort of dysregulation, potentially more the quieter, the worries, the tears, the ones that are able to elicit a bit more of parental compassion because, you know, I'm here to comfort you. Whereas the first one would be like, oh, you just bit me. I'm not sure I like this. And then there's actually a third one that we oftentimes forget, which is almost an over the top. I couldn't find a better word for this, but laughing or overstimulated and almost like I don't see what's very funny here, but I can't seem to slow you down. How do I return you back to baseline? So that's the emotional regulation challenges that we might have with the younger children who are not quite able to verbalize and explain how they're feeling internally. At school age, it starts to look a little bit different. Like I touched on earlier on, we start to think about, okay, social interaction anxiety. I maybe start to, recognize I'm different from them. Someone can run faster than me. Again, within developmentally expected challenges. But how does that start to look like for an autistic child or somebody who is developmentally delayed? The awareness of being different is almost accumulated, right? It's added on by the fact that they are autistic, and what does that look like? And not being able to quite connect with others around them. So recognizing the signs, that's really important as well. I would almost say, it sounds so silly to say this to parents or to people who know their child really well. It's changes to personality. Like what's changed? In the words of Taylor Swift, everything has changed. But really thinking backwards about it, what's changed for my child? They used to enjoy this and now they don't. They used to be really loud and gregarious and now they're really quiet. Or it's the opposite. Like I'm starting to see things that are a little bit different. There might be an increased rigidity. There might be a disinterest in things. There might be more touchiness. I'm starting to nitpick about lots of different things. Everything now bothers me. That wasn't a problem before. Or even I don't want to talk about it. I don't know. As a teenager, my favorite word was whatever. And coming from Singapore, they've actually capitalized on this and they made a drink called whatever. So if you go to Singapore, you can say, I want whatever, and you'll get a drink. But going back to topic, honing in on preferred interests, like really almost instead of just spending 30 minutes on this, I'm going to spend all my free time on this. And that can all be really interesting signs of not really coping well. Look, when and how to seek support, that's a $1 million question. And I think it goes back to the family and I think it goes back to the system. Can parents actually take on one more therapy on top of a weekly speech or a fortnightly OT or a multiple speech therapies? I don't know. But I think the answer to that is when you have the capacity to. There's always going to be competing priorities and everything can feel really important. So I think as a parent, it's really about thinking, okay, how do I fit this in? And initially, it potentially is something that I need to commit to, because it might be parent focused, the system that supports the child. Then it might be about bringing my child in, but recognizing that potentially a lot of the initial groundwork to be done actually lies with the parents. So now we're going to move into practical support. So checking in at a young age, let's normalize that, I put a picture of the feeling wheel there because I love it. It's actually my favorite thing in the world. For children who find feelings really hard, I like to go colors. Give me an example of a yellow. And if I still can't get very much, then I might move into body sensations. What's your body? How did your body feel about this? And if I still can't get very much, I might go a little bit further back in to give me a yucky feeling or give me a ugh feeling. And that generally will connect with some kids. So I think checking in is really important. Spending time together. Again, pretty difficult for most families when there's multiple therapies, when there's lots of medical appointments, when we're not sleeping well and I'm at the end of my thread, I'm just exhausted. But that's actually incredibly important because I need to know that person that's in front of me. I need to know when something's changed. And that kind of leads into curiosity as well. Maybe one day frozen was the flavor of the month, and tomorrow it's not that anymore. It's now bluey. When did that change? What happened? Being curious about it, but also being curious about their sensory preferences, their needs. Suddenly something's a little bit too loud, and younger children won't be able to explain this to you. They might just come back home and be dysregulated. And we're like, everything was fine. Kind of not. Everything wasn't fine. The last one is a bit weird, be human, but I really like that because I think a lot of times what parents miss and what educators miss is that our children think we're amazing. Our children think that we're super and that we never get anything wrong and that everything is, just easy because it looks easy. We have so much autonomy. We have the ability to change and swap and, try something different. We can say no. They can't. So having them realize that, hey, I've had a terrible, hair-pulling, exhausting type of a day is really refreshing for a child. And again, let's be wise about it. We're not trauma dumping. We're just speaking in their language, really simple, but actually acknowledging that today was a little bit hard. And it might be something as simple as I was so used to taking the same route home every day, and now there's a big detour sign, and my heart was racing a little bit because I didn't know. What if someone forgot to put a sign up? Then I'd just be circling around forever. And that's really nice for a kid to realize that, hey, we too struggle with uncertainty. So yeah, that's all I've got.
Thank you, Mei'en. That was such a lovely way of ending us. And I think a really lovely way of reflecting and being at the end about just being human and recognizing about how important it is to model talking about how we're feeling. I'm going to end with a couple of links and resources to come at some of the things we talked about. So including some links to how you can access support on sleeping sound training for if you're a professional educator or a supporter. You can access self-compassion online training through Aspect. We also mentioned at the top around, I guess, the prevalence of mental health concerns, particularly being relevant for females and gender diverse youth, and yellow litter bugs in Australia is a great resource for that. And just recently learnt about a massive online open course that was designed for and by and with autistic people, so that you can access for free through edX, through the Curtin University Autism Mental Health Group. We also have a few open projects that I've mentioned. Please do visit our website if you're interested